John here from Great Lakes Country, and I've got a really special one for you today. Perhaps one of the most exciting wild game cooking videos I've done yet. Because we're talking about whole giraffe neck roast. We're going to be seasoning it and searing it, stuffing it with mushrooms and all sorts of other good stuff, and then roasting it to become the most succulent and tender piece of meat. Now, as everybody knows, adult giraffe meat is incredibly tough, not to mention pretty prohibitive because of the sheer size of such a thing. So, of course, that's why we have to go with baby giraffe neck, or as I like to call it, long veal. And I'm sure you saw from the thumbnail that this is the neck roast we're dealing with today. And I'm not going to hold it up for the camera for too long because this thing's weighing in at about a whopping 30 pounds, and I simply can't hold it up like this forever. Now, this is a recipe video I've been wanting to make for a while, but as I'm sure you can imagine, sourcing baby giraffe meat isn't especially easy. But recently, my good friends over at Crazy Matumba's Exotic Meats sent me this amazing roast. Crazy Matumbas, you know their slogan, never tell anyone where you got it. Anyway, let's get into this giraffe roast. Alright, so let's get into what we're actually going to do with this thing. What I'm going for is a roast baby giraffe neck. But this thing's so big and thick that I think that the perfect way to prepare this would actually be to sort of slice it open and stuff it with some amazing things. Now, a quick anatomy lesson if you're not familiar with a giraffe neck. Obviously, the neck is comprised of a lot of muscle and tendons and ligaments and things like that. This right here is basically the usable muscle that makes up the meat that we can actually eat and enjoy. And this thing is comprised of three main muscle groups, and I won't pretend like I know what they're all called exactly, but we've got this main muscle running along the back, and you can see there's a fair amount of fat running the whole length of that. And then we got these two different muscles on the top side. And to give you a little perspective of how this would actually, be connected to a giraffe, here we would have the spine running along and connecting kind of in between these two muscle groups. And down through the center of this whole thing is where the giraffe's esophagus would be. Kind of in between this main long muscle group here and these two sort of narrower ones here. Now, I'd love to be able to roast this whole thing just as it is, but unfortunately, it is just simply too long for my oven or any roasting pan that I own. If I had like a great big long offset smoker and it was a little warmer outside, well, this thing would be amazing to put on that. But it's still pretty cold outside, and my smoker also just isn't long enough. So as much as it pains me to do so, I think I'm gonna have to cut this thing down, probably more than just in half. I think I'm gonna have to go thirds so this thing actually fits comfortably into the roasting pans and the oven itself. So let me get this thing segmented out, and then we can take a bit of a closer look at one of these pieces and see what we're dealing with. So with this cross section, you can kind of get a better look at what we're talking about here. We got this main muscle group that runs along the front of the entire neck, and then these two smaller muscle groups along the back that attach to the spine. And so what I want to do is actually kind of cut in between these two muscles and just sort of fillet this out a little bit. I don't want to cut all the way through them where they kind of attach, but just sort of spread them out a bit, because that's where we're going to put all of our amazing stuffing. And you might see a lot of this fat sort of sitting on top here, and giraffe fat tastes okay, but it doesn't render down really all that well compared to some other animals. So I will probably go through and trim just a bit of this off, because we just simply don't need all of that. So then I'll go through and just sort of slice this down the center a little bit, separating these two muscle groups, and then kind of get underneath there a little bit so I can spread them all out to the side. Yeah, something like that looks pretty good. And obviously once I fill this all with my stuffing mixture, I'm going to have to tie it all back up with some butcher's twine, but that's totally okay. Alright, next let's get this thing seasoned up. You can pretty much use whatever kind of seasoning or rub you want. I think I'm going to start with some kosher salt, of course, Nice generous coating on all sides and surfaces. I'll get a little bit on the inside, but the mixture that we're putting in there is pretty savory, so I don't want to over salt the inside here, but it's still a pretty thick piece of meat, so I'm probably not too worried about over salting. And make sure to get the other side. And of course these ends we don't want to forget. Of course some black pepper. Nice coarse black pepper is always good for seasoning just about anything. Again, it's a pretty hefty cut of meat, so you're not going to really risk over seasoning it that much. And I think some garlic powder would be a nice addition. Wow, this powder's really fine. A little finer than the stuff I normally buy. But in this economy, you got to get what you can get, I suppose. And lastly, I don't know if this will really contribute much, but some paprika seems like a good idea. If for nothing else, it'll give us some nice color. And before I really go any further and start cooking that meat, I need to do a fair amount of prep work because we've got a wonderful stuffing component that's going to be going inside of this whole thing. So I'll start by peeling and mincing up 2 shallots. Although these are some pretty humongous shallots, so I think I'm just going to do 1. Now I need about half of a yellow onion, so I'll peel it and just chop it up, pretty standard. And some celery. Normally I would do 2 or 3 of these little ribs, but these are pretty small, so I'll just do 4. And I'm just gonna slice them up. And here I've got 5 slices of some pretty hearty white bread, and I'll just cut them up into some cubes. And because we're going to be doing a sort of a Duxelles thing, we need a whole lot of cremini mushrooms, also known as baby Bella. And I've just got to get these all chopped up pretty finely. Yes, I could use a food processor, and I've done that in the past, but it's only a pound, and I've already got the board out and the knife, so I guess I'll just go through and chop them up the old-fashioned way. Nothing too particular, just take these whole cremini mushrooms and chop them down until they're pretty small. And yes, we're keeping the stems because there's nothing wrong with them. Next up, some fresh parsley. I need to remove most of the stems and just mince this up until I've got about a half cup of it. And I need 4 or 5 minced or crushed cloves of garlic, so I'll just run them through the old garlic press. And I need to pick the leaves off of a couple of sprigs of fresh thyme, which, by the way, is one of my least favorite things to do. Some people make this look so fast and easy, and all I seem to do is break the stem while I'm trying to pull the leaves off of it. But whatever, I'll manage, and we'll end up with some lovely fresh thyme. Alright, now I've got a whole bunch of fresh spinach, and I'm just gonna give it all a rough chop. I don't really need to mince this down into nothing, but just sort of break down some of these larger pieces so it's a little less unwieldy to work with. Now we're moving over to the stove so we can start getting this stuffing component made, starting with the Duxelles. So I'll get a couple tablespoons of butter melting in my big enamel Dutch oven, and then I'm throwing in my shallot, followed by all those chopped up cremini mushrooms. Over top I'll sprinkle a teaspoon of kosher salt and a teaspoon of black pepper, and get everything all mixed together and nicely coated in that melted butter. Now I just need to let this all cook down for a few minutes. Those mushrooms are going to release a ton of moisture, and I want to keep going until almost all of that is cooked off. When it has, I'll add 1/3 cup of dry cooking sherry to the pot. Be sure to scrape the bottom with a wooden spoon to dislodge any brown bits or anything stuck on there. At this time, I'll also throw in the leaves from those couple of thyme sprigs and a teaspoon of ground sage. I'll let this all cook for a couple more minutes until most of that sherry is reduced. Then I'm tossing in a 1/2 cup of chopped parsley and all of that roughly chopped spinach. Give it all a couple minutes to wilt down and cook off any standing liquid. Now I've got the heat off, and we're moving over to the other burner where I've got my deep cast iron skillet heating up. I'll go in with another couple tablespoons of butter and get that melting. And then in goes that yellow onion and celery, and I'll let that saute for a couple minutes. When it's just starting to soften, I'll add in the garlic and cook another minute. Finally, I'll kill the heat and dump in those bread cubes,
fold and stir it all in so the bread can start absorbing some of that melted butter and moisture from the veg. And now I'm throwing all of that into the Dutch oven with the Duxelles and stirring everything together. Now my stuffing mixture is complete, so I'll set it aside to cool for a few minutes while I finish preparing the meat.
Alright, now I'm of course going to eventually tie this whole thing up all the way down, but to get started, so my stuffing kind of has a little cradle to sit in and I don't risk any of it spilling out, I'll just tie a string right near both ends to kind of close that up a little. See if I can remember how to do my butcher's knots. That's not too bad. Trim some of this excess string out of there. Now we've got this perfect little cavity in which we can put a bunch of that stuffing. This stuff has cooled down quite a bit, but it's still a little bit warm. That's perfectly okay. And I'm just going to start getting that in there any which way I can, just about as much as it'll hold. Should be able to fit a fair amount inside of here. I think that's about as much as it's going to take and still be able to close it up. Ooh, that's stuffed pretty full. This thing doesn't exactly want to stay tied, so I'm going to have to double knot it. I think that's alright. This is acting a little unwieldy, so I think I'm just going to do separate strings rather than trying to do a classic twining job. Look fine, and it's going to give us a little more structural integrity. Well, I did lose a little bit of stuffing as I cinched this thing up, and I want to make sure this is real nice and tidy looking, so I'll kind of just clean this up a little bit. None of that stuffing really hanging out because I worry that it might burn if it's left exposed like that, but just do the best I can. This isn't exactly a recipe I've made a lot of times. Alright, that's looking pretty good to me, so I'll get the other two segments of this neck roast done up just the same way as I did this one, and then we're moving over to the stove and we're going to start searing. And here I've got my steel-made, full-sized griddle flat top heated up. I'll put down a little bit of vegetable oil, and then on go those roasts. And yeah, I could have done this with one or two big skillets, but I really liked the idea of being able to sear them all at the same time so they're all ready for the oven at the same time. So I'll just lay them down on that flat top, give them a few minutes, and then move them around, roll them to the other side, make sure I've got some nice color all the way around. I'm not looking for a super hard crust on these, but I do want to give it some nice color. And you know, I might as well stand these things up and give those ends a bit of a sear as well. Now these things are ready for the oven, and I've got it preheated to 350 degrees. And none of my ordinary roasting pans or cast iron will fit all three of these things, but they will all fit in a full-size hotel pan. So that's what I'm going to use. I'll load all three of these beasts into this hotel pan. And lastly, I'll stick the probe from my digital thermometer into the thickest part of one of those roasts so I can monitor the internal temp in real time. I don't precisely know how long these are going to take to roast, so I'll just let them go until the thickest part of one of those has an internal temperature of 145 to 150 degrees, which is the minimum safe internal temperature when cooking giraffe meat. So we'll let these go a little while and pick it back up when they're coming out of the oven. Lastly, we need to make a little sauce to drizzle over our slices of roast giraffe. There's a lot of savory flavors going on in that stuffing and on the meat itself, so I'm thinking something like a honey garlic sauce. So into a little saucepan, I'll get half a pound of butter melting over medium heat. Then I'm adding in half a cup of honey, a quarter cup of balsamic vinegar, a quarter cup of soy sauce, about 6 or 7 cloves of minced garlic, a pinch of kosher salt, and a pinch of crushed red pepper flake. I'll stir that all together and leave it on the heat for just a couple more minutes until that butter's completely melted. Then I'm hitting the whole thing with the immersion blender, just to make sure everything's totally incorporated and to introduce a little bit of aeration, which is just going to give my sauce a little more body. Okay, and after what was a little more than 2 hours, these roasts are finally ready to come out of the oven. And those are looking absolutely amazing. I think I may have overstuffed this first one a little bit, but I'm not too worried about that. I might just have to sort of scrape down a little bit of that stuffing that did get a little charred. But all in all, these are looking terrific. So now I need to very carefully get these out of this hotel pan and over to the cookie sheet so I can let them rest. And these things are way too hot for me to touch with any kind of gloves or whatever that I have on hand. So let me see if I can do this with some utensils. Those are looking absolutely gorgeous, and I can't wait to dig into one of these. But first, I gotta let it rest. So I'll cover it all up with some aluminum foil. It doesn't have to be super tight. Just make sure it's pretty well covered. And we're gonna come back in just a few minutes and finally slice into this thing. All right, let's get into this thing and see how it looks. Oh, that stuffing sure doesn't look like nearly as much once it's all cooked down, huh? Either way, this thing's looking absolutely juicy and delicious. So I think I need to try me a slice. But of course, I can't forget about that honey garlic sauce. Flavorful doesn't even begin to describe how that tastes. The meat, absolutely tender and delicious, perfectly seasoned. That Duxelles sort of stuffing that I packed in there definitely brought a lot of great flavor to it. It's a little disappointing to see once I do the cross section how small of an area that stuffing actually does consume, and you aren't going to get some of that in every single bite. Nevertheless, it came out great. That honey garlic drizzle that I put over top of it just adds another layer of flavor and a dimension to it that I'm extremely happy with. It's hard to describe exactly what giraffe meat tastes like. It's got a light gaminess to it, but it's really not overpowering. It's not overwhelming any of the other flavors in any way that's unpleasant. But of course, with all game meat, a lot of that comes down to how you treat the meat and process the animal and everything in between. And I'll certainly do my part to eat as much of this neck roast as I can, but I'm sure not going to be able to polish off all of it. So I'm going to have some friends come over. Everyone's going to partake. Have ourselves a little giraffe feast tasting party, I guess. So there you have it. The most tender and delicious... Hang on one second. Sorry about that. Oh, it's Crazy Matumbo. Hello?
Hello, my friend.
Hey, how are you?
I am doing well, thank you. Just calling to ask how you enjoyed the delivery.
Oh, as a matter of fact, I just finished cooking it. It came out amazing.
Excellent. I am so happy to hear that. And you are not telling anyone where you got it, right?
No.
Good. That is good. That is very important. Okay, I must go. I will talk with you soon.
All right. You take care.
Goodbye.
All right. Thanks again, Matumba. Good to hear from you. Anyway, that's about it. If you ever have the opportunity, I highly recommend trying a baby giraffe roast for yourself. As always, be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future wild game cooking and April Fool's videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.